The last chapter on the digestive system ended with this, where you had eaten molecules which were just large polysaccharides, large proteins, triglycerides, and these had come from other species, so starch from plants, animal proteins, corn oil, etc. But what your digestive system had done was to break these large molecules into their smaller components, and these had been absorbed into the blood or lymph, which ends up in the blood. The next chapter on metabolism then simply asks the question, well, now what? Now that the remains of your lunch, say, are in your blood capillaries or are, in the chylomicrons in your lymphatic capillaries, the lacteals, what happens now? And so this is what the chapter on metabolism is. Metabolism, simply defined, is simply the sum of all of the chemical reactions that occur in your body. The first part of the chapter is on cellular respiration, and then it simply asks the question. Let's say you start off with glucose, all right, say from starch. How does that become energy? Because once again, your body is 100 degrees, even in winter. You have a large brain. You have a very active lifestyle. So how do you get the energy molecules, the glucose, to power this? Now, cellular respiration is often covered in introductory biology classes and is very rarely the favorite topic for students. Now, one can easily get that, this is involved. But that being said, it's incredibly important. So as I go through this process, which is the first portion of our metabolism topic, hopefully you leave it understanding, A, that it's understandable, but B, hopefully you then realize, wow, this is so important and so integral. So what happens with the glucose that came from the meal you ate, was transported through your blood and ended up being absorbed in a cell? Well, we could do this, where in a series of reactions catalyzed by different enzymes, each enzyme here is depicted in green. So in a series of chemical reactions, these glucose molecules are then modified, and after a long series of events, phosphates are added, phosphates are removed. This molecule is then converted into two separate molecules. We then get to this molecule here, which we call pyruvate. All right, well, that seemed painful. What happened? Well, it's very easy to sum up in about a sentence. That process that you just observed, there's a name for that process. It's called glycolysis. Now, notice that we end with molecules of pyruvate, which are 3 carbons each. But we start with glucose, which is a single molecule, which is 6 carbons, 6 black dots. So essentially, in the process of glycolysis, glucose is broken in half, 1 6-carbon molecule to 2 3-carbon molecules. This can occur anywhere in a cell. It doesn't have to occur in a special place like the mitochondria. It does not require oxygen, and you get a little bit of energy from it. Now, if you wanted to watch the full video, it would go into a little more detail, where initially ADP is required to start this off, but that while 2 ATPs are invested at first, 4 ATPs result. So it's like investing money. You invest a little bit of money with the odds, with the hope that you'll get more back. So a few energy molecules of ATP were invested and more were removed. So if you were to sum up the first step of cellular respiration, called glycolysis, one could sum it up this way: that glucose is broken in half, a 6-carbon molecule to 2 3-carbon molecules, that this can occur anywhere in the cell. Oxygen is not needed, and a little bit of energy is gotten. On to step 2. Now, in AMP1, you might have, before going into step 2, realized that you don't have to go any further. This could be more or less the end process. Unfortunately, pyruvate becomes pyruvic acid, which, it is toxic in large quantities. So your body converts it to lactic acid, which is better, but still that's a problem. And that lactic acid, which builds up in exercise, is a cause of fatigues and cramps. So in AMP1, you could, continue with this conversation in a different direction. But we're going to assume that you now have enough oxygen to go into the second portion of cellular respiration. So this is step 2, known as the Krebs cycle. Step 1, glycolysis. Step 2, the Krebs cycle. So in step 2, the pyruvate, which had originated from the food you eat, gets processed. A coenzyme is added to it, so it now becomes acetyl coenzyme A. It gets added to a starter molecule, oxaloacetic acid, which becomes citric acid, aconitic acid, isocitric acid, alpha-ketoglutarate acid, succinyl coenzyme A, succinic acid, fumaric acid, malic acid, which gets then converted back to oxaloacetic acid. And since that's the starter molecule, you can now bring in a second molecule of pyruvate, which becomes a second molecule of acetyl coenzyme A. And then you can go through this process again. What have you accomplished? Because it seems like, we've gotten back to the starter molecule where we began. Well, the answer is that we have broken this down. In my classes, just to be a little more dramatic, what I do at this point is I inhale and then I exhale and I say, I'm sorry. And then I ask my students, what was that? And then they'll say, oh, that was an exhale. That was carbon dioxide. And I'll say, no, better answer. There's a better answer. And then they're confused. And then I say, the answer I'm looking for is something like a chicken fajita. They'll look at me odd. And then I say, well, look at it this way. In the last month, you ate a lot of food. Let's imagine that we could put that on a table. Let's imagine here's a table where we put all of the food that you've eaten in the past month. Now, some of it was fiber that passed through your digestive tract. We're not talking about that. We're talking about what was absorbed into your body. So imagine a table that has all of the food that you've eaten. Let's imagine we weigh that table. It would weigh something. So the stuff that's come into your body in the past month would weigh something. How much weight have you gained in the past month? And for most people, you haven't. You're about the same weight as you were. So what happened? So all of the stuff came into your body. What happened to it? And the answer is it left through your nose. See, this molecule of carbon dioxide, that molecule of carbon dioxide, you started with a molecule of pyruvate. This was pyruvate that came from glucose. Maybe it came from bread or pizza crust or noodles or some source of starch. This was molecules of food. All right, but then you took that. So those 3 carbons, that came from something that you ate today for lunch, let's say. It was added to your body. But now you broke off 1 carbon, it became carbon dioxide, and over a series of steps, those other 2 molecules came off in the form of carbon dioxide. So 3 carbons came into your body in the food that you ate, and then 3 molecules of carbon dioxide have been produced, which are now going to come out your nose when you exhale. So in the Krebs cycle, if you wanted to sum it up in a sentence or so, one could say that the carbon from the food you eat gets added to a starter molecule, and that is converted into carbon dioxide over a series of steps. Okay. Now, before we go on, in the respiratory system, you talked about, you needed carbon dioxide, to go from your tissues into your blood and get exhaled at your lungs. But you never said where the carbon dioxide was coming from. So part of the respiratory system chapter didn't make sense until this moment. Okay. So the carbon and the oxygen, that's now coming out your nose. What's left? Hydrogen, the red dots. And so glucose has 3 things in it. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. The carbon and the oxygen have just come out your nose. That leaves the hydrogen. What happens with that? Well, hydrogen is very important. You can power a car using hydrogen. Hydrogen can be used as a fuel, as does your body. Your body essentially runs on hydrogen. You transport hydrogen to your mitochondria. Your mitochondria have an outer membrane and an inner membrane. So Coenzymes like those which are derived from B vitamins carry hydrogen to this inner membrane. And then these hydrogen atoms, which have two parts, a positive hydrogen proton and an electron, these get dropped off at membrane carrier number 1, which are then transported to membrane carrier number 2, membrane carrier number 3, etc. So they're passed along what's called the ETS, the electron transport system. So this was hydrogen from the food you ate. It got passed along a series of carriers in the inner mitochondrial membrane in such a way that the hydrogen ions, the positive parts, end up here in the intermembrane space, while the electrons end up here in the matrix. Now, this is not stable, all right? Because if the hydrogen ions are in their intermembrane space, they're in an area of high concentration. Things naturally want to go from an area of high concentration to low, not only because of diffusion, but now because there's a charge difference. Here is positive, there is negative. So there's potential energy here, all right? Just like someone who's dying to get into a room. Well, if you put a turnstile in the doorway, that person, if they want to get in the room badly enough, they'll walk through the turnstile, they'll do a little work in order to get to where they want to go. And the same thing here, we put turnstiles in this membrane, proteins whose bottoms actually spin. And so the hydrogen ions in the inner membrane space, they want so badly to get to where the electrons are that they're willing to go through this turnstile. And we're just now going to make a little bit of work get done as they do this. So if this is ADP and this is a phosphate, then as this turns, when a hydrogen ion goes through, now you generate a molecule of ATP. Well, this is exciting because ATP is what muscles use to contract. ATP is what we use to pull chromosomes apart in a dividing cell. ATP is what we use to keep warm. ATP is what we use to pump ions across opposite sides of a nerve cell and to generate thought. ATP is the battery that has been used to power your life. And so the main way that you have gotten ATP, you did get a little bit in glycolysis, but the main way that you get ATP is the two halves of hydrogen are separated, one half here, one half here. They desperately want to get back together again. And we let them at a special gate, which generates ATP when hydrogen ions go through. Once again, extremely important. This is where the energy which has powered your life has come from. Now, the problem is that hydrogen is explosive, all right? That's why, one of the things that hydrogen cars have to worry about, how do you not explode? Hydrogen is so reactive. And the answer is these oxygen atoms here, all right? So when oxygen catches essentially the hydrogen ion and the electron, it then forms molecules of water. So hydrogen is no longer explosive, but now it is quite stable, and we can eliminate excess water in a number of ways if we need to. Now, once again, getting back to the respiratory system, I'm sure you learned you need to breathe oxygen. Why? What does oxygen do? Well, this is what it does. So that respiratory system chapter, it didn't make sense until now. This is why we breathe oxygen, because we want to rip the hydrogen off of the food we eat and use that to generate ATP potential energy. But the only way that works is if someone stably catches hydrogen so it doesn't explode. That's oxygen, which is a very good electron acceptor. And so oxygen atoms, from the oxygen that we breathe, they catch the hydrogen. And so thus, cellular respiration has 3 steps. It has glycolysis, where glucose is broken in half. It has the Krebs cycle, where the carbon from the food you eat is converted to carbon dioxide. And then the electron transport system, where hydrogen ions are separated on either side of a membrane. When the two come together in the presence of oxygen, it forms ATP. This earlier session, this was known as the electron transport system, all right, as electrons are transported along the inner membrane here. And once again, even though it isn't the average student's favorite part of a course, nevertheless, it is incredibly important. Most of the food that you have ever eaten goes here. This is where you've generated the ATP, which has powered your life. This is where the oxygen goes, and this is why you need to breathe oxygen. This is where your carbon dioxide comes from. So without an understanding of this topic, the respiratory and digestive systems, they don't really make sense. And so in the chapter of metabolism, what do we do with the food that we eat? Because you take such an incredible amount of energy to run, because you're warm-blooded, you have a big brain, you have an active lifestyle. You need an incredible amount of ATP, which powers your life. It is ATP that allows myosin muscle proteins to pull on actin. It is ATP which pumps sodium out of nerve cells. It is ATP which pulls, dividing chromosomes apart, etc. So this is the first portion of the metabolism chapter.